Okay, good afternoon. Bon pomeriggio, buenas tardes. The Vito Marcantonio Forum welcomes you to Beloved Comrades, the political and personal relationship of Annette T. Rubinstein, 1912 to 2007, and Vito Marcantonio, who unfortunately lived a much shorter life, 1902 to 1954. A presentation by Professor Gerald Meyer and Stephen Siciliano. My name is Gil Fagiani, and I will be your chairperson this afternoon. First, I would like to ask that everyone turn off their cell phones and electronic devices. I want to begin by thanking Shelly Macklin, acting manager of the Mulberry Street Public Library, for the use of this wonderful space today. The Vito Marcantonio Forum, or the VMF, is a historical, cultural, and educational organization that brings together people from a wide variety of backgrounds, interested in sharing knowledge of the life and work of Congressman Vito Marcantonio. A protege of Fiorello LaGuardia, Marcantonio was the most electorally successful radical American politician of the 20th century. He served as congressman from East Harlem for 14 years, 1934 to 36, and 1938 to 1950. Critical to his success was his unique multi-ethnic coalition of Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. Professor Meyer will give a much more detailed biography of Annette Rubinstein, but for now I'd like to mention that she was an author, educator, and political leader whose work spanned an arc of 75 years. In 1939, she began her involvement with the American Labor Party, which included working closely with Marcantonio, who served as the ALP's state chairperson. Today's presentation marks the VMF's, I think, 21st event since it was reconstituted in 2011. So I'm going to give a summary of some of the VMF's activities. The celebration, which include the celebration of the fourth printing of Professor Meyer's book, Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, on October 27, 2011, at the Breck Forum. The special tribute, Vito Marcantonio and the Puerto Rican People, Solidarity and Progress, which took place on November 28, 2012, and was attended by more than 100 people at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. And then there was a panel, Vito Marcantonio, spokesman for the left, which was presented June 8, 2013 at the annual Left Forum held at Pace University. On February 22nd, 2014, at this venue, the VMF presented a book party with dramatic readings and a discussion of The Heart is the Teacher by Leonard Covello, who was a teacher and educational theorist, long-term East Harlem resident, activist, and one of the most important historical figures in the Italian-American community in the 20th century. On May 10th, 2014, the VMF, along with the Italian-American Writers Association, sponsored again at this venue as part of our author series, this one featuring Simone Cinotto's The Italian-American Table, Food, Family, and Community in New York City. On July 10th, 2014, VMF's member Anna Filomena, who to our great sadness passed away earlier this year, presented her book, So You Want to Be an Italian, at the Italian American Museum. Participants included Professor Meyer, Lulu Lolo, and Roberto Ragoni. On August 9, 2014, on the 60th anniversary of Vito Marcantonio's death, 70 people gathered at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx to celebrate his life. To further his memory, Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz and New York City Council member and Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito attended and sponsored a proclamation naming August 9th as Vito Marcantonio Day in the Bronx. They also promised to work with us to name a street after Marcantonio. In celebration of Black History Month, the VMF sponsored a talk, East Harlem's African American Community, by Chris Bell, author of East Harlem Remembered, Oral Histories of Community and Diversity, which was here again on February 28, 2015. And Chris, I think you have some books for sale. We have the book by Annette Rubinstein for a special price of $10, and there's two of my books here too. Here again, May 4th, 2015, in celebration of Labor History Month, the VMF sponsored a presentation by Professor Meyer on the American Labor Party with dramatizations by Robert Ragoni and Art Bernal. On Saturday, May 9th, 2015, at the Cornelia Street Cafe, the VMF and the Italian American Writers Association featured two VMF founders, Stephen Siciliano, who's going to present again today, who read from his latest novel manuscript, The Good Father, that tells the story of radical Congressman Vito Marcantonio through the eyes of neighboring family, and yours truly, Gil Fagiani, who read from his collection of poetry set in East Harlem, A Blanquito and El Barrio. On September 19, 2015, the Vito Marcantonio celebrated Pope Francis's visit to East Harlem and Italian-American Culture Month with the People's Pilgrimage to East Harlem. Starting at Lucky Corner at 116th Street and Lexington Avenue at 12 p.m., the walk included a visit to Vito Marcantonio's home, as well as Our Lady Queen of Angels Elementary School that Pope Francis later would visit. On October 15th at Ostos Community College, the VMF presented a talk by Professor Gerald Meyer and dramatizations by Lulu Lolo Pasquale and Roberto Ragoni on the theme Congressman Vito Marcantonio, a champion of immigrant rights. And here on October 31st, the VMF sponsored a symposium on Michael Parente's memoir, set in East Harlem, I should mention, Waiting for Yesterday, Pages from a Street Kid's Life, that included a talk by Stephen Siciliano, readings by Lulu Lolo, and a dramatization by Roberto Ragoni. Finally, on February 5th of this year, at Gaetana's Cucina Italiana, Professor Meyer and Roberto Ragoni presented the Speaker of the New York City Council, Melissa Mark Viverito, with the Vito Marcantonio Award for her record of progressive political activism in the spirit of Congressman Marcantonio. The event was chaired by Maria Lacella, with a talk by Professor Meyer, Vito Marcantonio now more than ever, and a performance by Lulu Lolo and a dramatization by Roberto Ragoni. Again, I want to remind people that we have books for sale today. Before I turn the program over to our first presenter, I will read along with Roberto Ragoni and Louis Romero what has become a tradition at our events, my poem, Litany of San Vito. So the way that we work this is I'm going to first, Roberto is going to read a line in English, then I'll read the same line in Italian, and Louis will read the same line in Spanish.
San Vito of East Harlem, pray for us.
San Vito di East Harlem, prega per noi.
San Vito de East Harlem, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, bread of the poor, pray for us.
San Vito, pane dei poveri, prega per noi.
San Vito, pan de los pobres, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, crucified by Wall Street, pray for us.
San Vito, crocifisso da Wall Street, prega per noi.
San Vito, crucificado por Wall Street, ruega por nosotros.
San Vito, martyr of McCarthyism, pray for us.
San Vito, martire del marcartismo, prega per noi.
San Vito, mártir del marcatismo, ruega por nosotros.
From the jail cell walls, San Vito, deliver us.
Dalle pareti della prigione, San Vito, liberaci.
De las paredes de la cárcel, San Vito, líbranos.
From the backyard crap game, San Vito, deliver us.
Dal gioco d'azzardo nel cortile, San Vito, liberaci.
Del juego de dados en el patio, San Vito, líbranos.
From the loan shark's vig, San Vito, deliver us.
Dal pizzo dello stronzino, San Vito, liberaci.
Del prestamista sin escrúpulos, San Vito, líbranos.
From the drunken stupor, San Vito, deliver us.
Dall'ubriachezza molesta, San Vito, liberaci.
De la embriaguez del alcohol, San Vito, líbranos.
From TB and asthma, San Vito, protect us.
Dal tubercolosi e asma, San Vito, proteggici.
De la tuberculosis y el asma, San Vito, protégenos.
From the social worker's visit, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla visita dell'assistente sociale, San Vito, proteggici.
De la visita del trabajador social, San Vito, protégenos.
From the immigration raids, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla caccia agli immigranti, San Vito, proteggici.
De las redadas de inmigración, San Vito, protégenos.
From the landlord's greed, San Vito, protect us.
Dalla avarizia del padrone di casa, San Vito, proteggici.
De la avaricia del casero, San Vito, protégenos.
Amen.
So to begin today's program, Professor Gerald Meyer is a founding member of the faculty of Ostos Community College. He is the author of Vito Marcantonio, Radical Politician, which is in its fourth printing. He co-edited The Lost World of Italian-American Radicalism with Philip Canistraro and has had published 80 articles and reviews on a wide range of subjects. Professor Meyer serves on the editorial boards of Socialism and Democracy and Science and Society. He appears in documentaries, reviews manuscripts for publication, and lectures widely. He has been politically active since his mid-teens and is presently co-chair of the Vito Marcantonio Forum.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out in the cold, and we'll keep each other warm. Yeah, thanks. Is it okay? Yeah. It's so good to be here and to hear the litany being put to good use. I remember, I was raised Catholic. My mother's Irish. I'm coming out of the closet about everything, But I kind of like the litanies, because it's sort of like you get into gotta feel like we're gonna elevate it, It's kind of a repetition, protect us, save us, I could, but then I walked out on that when I was 15. So then I joined the left to get away from all that, and now we're doing this here, but this is for, so everything comes around, goes around. But this is for a good purpose, and I do think that being on the left is a spiritual experience, and for all of us. And it doesn't mean you have to believe in God. It just means that you believe there's something more bigger than yourself that you use for guidance and to keep us on a path, a difficult path, because of the principles involved. And I think that is spiritual, and it's spiritual in a way that's the best kind of spirituality, because it doesn't divide us from other people. It's humanistic. It incorporates humanity. So I'm so good that we have the litany, and that Gil wrote this for us, and that we're using the languages of the people in America, not just English, and that we believe that democracy does not mean that people should be forced to give up their cultures and languages. You don't have to give up a language to become an American. We're not Anglo-Saxons, I don't think, you know, and we don't have to be if we don't want to be, and if we make some effort, we won't be. And that's for our benefit, and it's against the people that are trying to hurt us. So I'm very proud to be a member of this society. It's just been wonderful. Annette said, you know, that she lived, she felt just before she died, she said that she had had a very happy life because she had a great cause that she could dedicate herself to, and she had literature. And I didn't know Marcantonio, but I was drawn by something into this orbit of his life and him that just caught me, and I've never escaped it. You know, not that I've tried very hard, but I was doing a doctoral dissertation, and I just went to the Tammany Library for material, and there wasn't really that much about him there. I was a little disappointed, and the wonderful librarian who was there said, "Well, you have to go to 42nd Street. That's where his papers are." So I went there, but by that time it was raining out, and I got there around 4 o'clock. They were closing at 5, and what to do? And they gave me this big finder's aid, you know. So I started looking. It was so daunting. There were like 60 boxes. But I said there were letters from constituents, and 1950. Well, 1950. I was born in 40. I remember those days very, very well. And so I said, well, I'd love to see some of these letters from 1950. And I started looking. It was so interesting. The penmanship was so good in those days, you know, and these compositions of ordinary people, poor people, working people, Italian names, Spanish names, Puerto Rican people, and Jewish names, you know, some Irish names scattered, and African American people with, you know, brown. You could pick it out, and then the addresses, because they in every case the staff had stapled the letter to the envelope, and on the envelope you could get the address. Now you could figure out the ethnicity, and the letters all were the same. They were all some recitation of some need that they had for housing. Some of it was heartbreaking beyond belief. I found quite a few letters of people in the family. Usually the women would do most of the writing, you know, as we would understand, and of members of the family that were remanded to mental institutions in upstate New York, and seeking the transfer of the family members to the city so that they could visit. Things of that sort, just heartbreaking things. So I'm reading through this and becoming more and more interested. And then I picked out a letter, and the letter read, she said, "You know, Mark," she said, "you're so familiar." It was just so familiar. She says, "You know, Mark," she said, "everybody knows that you help everybody. And you know that I have 3 children and they don't have a daddy." She goes, "And I want that you give me a small turkey. And I'm sure you will, because you are the bread of the poor people." That was it. So that was it. So that becomes my mission. You know, Wendell Phillips, he was the abolitionist, a great abolitionist, and he was a happy old guy. So somebody said, "Well, why are you so happy?" He goes, "If you want to be happy," he says, "you just have to dedicate your life to an unpopular cause." So, anyway, it's better than Valium. I mean, really, whatever. And therapy, it helps off and on, but, that goes on and on. But, so anyway, I'm so glad to be here. Well, I do feel very often that I knew Marcantonio, believe me, I do. And I do pursue this continually, and I'm glad I've done that. But I did know Annette. I knew Annette very well. Once I started my dissertation on Mark, everyone is saying, you have to go and speak to Annette. You have to speak to Annette. Well, I went there. What a gracious woman. I've drawn into her living room, which really I discovered later was a salon. She was a single woman. She had lived with her mother, never married, and she, I was smart not to do so, I suspect. And but what she did really is create a salon. And in this, what seemed to be such a large space, later I said it wasn't large at all. She organized that in a way that there were meetings of all kinds, political meetings, the boards of left-wing journals, and increasingly classes. She taught, my guess is 75 classes, and every time, almost never repeating the same topic. She was a genius. And in her living room, that would be filled with 20, 30 people in this L-shaped living room. And she would always have food for people. Coffee, tea, cakes, maybe some leftover sandwiches, always had food. And as I was drawn more into her life and into her circle, she knew how to do that, I want you to know. What I realized is that she hosted 2 dinners a week. One for family and one for friends. And she made dinners twice a week. And she knew how to mix and match people so effectively. How to match people up. If she would have been a matchmaker, she would have made a fortune. She just knew exactly who to bring to them and where they should sit and all the rest. And how could this woman who's single, organize? We think we put on like a dinner, whatever. We think it's a big deal. She did this twice a week. Now, she thought the whole thing through. One thing she did is she had a warming tray. Who here has a warming tray? If you're going to, that's good. You're letting the cat out of the bag every. But that's good. Now, did you learn that from Annette? That's the question. But if you're going to be the hostess at dinners where there's nobody in the kitchen helping you, you've got to do all the food. It was nothing that needed to be stirred. That took me around 7 years. It took me longer to figure that one out than how to read Russian. That all the food served could not be stirred. It had to go in the oven and come out of the oven onto the tray. What a good life. Anyway, and so I started being invited to these dinners. And extraordinary woman. Well, she's born into an immigrant Jewish family in the Lower East Side. And on both her mother and father's side, they were socialists. This was extremely common. That socialism was a mass phenomenon among Jews and everywhere, and certainly also in the United States. And I do think it had something to do with leaving the religion, and which promised the redemption of the whole people, and promised the millennium, that there would be justice at some point, that justice would occur, and in leaving the peculiaristic religion, a religion for the Jewish people, and leaving that behind, the adoption of a kind of universalization and secularization of the religion led to socialist thinking, which took many, many, many different varieties. I mean, the number of varieties is just extraordinary. The whole spectrum of socialism and anarchism, by the way, was all present in the Jewish community on a very, very large basis. And attendant with this socialist culture was tremendous amounts of learning. It had to do with study. It had to do very often with the maintenance of language, Yiddish, for example, and setting up separate institutions, book clubs, libraries, fraternal organizations, schools, a type of a creation of a whole infrastructure for a community based on the ideology of socialism. And that was the incubator for, I think, the great productivity culturally of the Jewish people. The cultural development has to do with ideas, and all the ideas were there, and the disputation about the ideas was tremendously energetic in terms of intellectual development and production. And Annette grew up in that. And her mother, Jean, she then lived with her entire life. She lived with Jean. Jean died first, predeceased her, but she lived together with her mother. And but her father, who was a socialist, also had really the genius in the family. He was a mathematical wizard, and had started as a kind of tutor for immigrant children, and developed that into a business, which some of the people might remember, the Rhodes School. I remember that. They used to be advertised in the subway. He was the founder of that. And it was an adult education school that prepared students for the exam, to get the college diploma, the Regis diploma. And with the Regis diploma, it allowed for admission to City College. So that was the clientele for the Rhodes School. And he made a lot of money with that. And I was talking to someone earlier from the family a bit, somewhat distant from the family. And the father, I think, knew how to make money and lose money, you know? And there was a whole kind of succession of opening family businesses, which then would fail. Some of them for external circumstances, the Great Depression, but also starting a business during the Great Depression that flourished. So he had a lot of entrepreneurial skills and was a smart man. And I think it did something else. I think with the family businesses, it drew the family together. There were 4 children, and the mother and father, and they all worked together in these enterprises. And I think that very often can happen. I think the closeness that at least we've seen, I think until recently at least, in Italian families, very often had a lot to do with family businesses. And drawing people into the practical world, not just the emotive world, but into the actual world of work and money and so on, and getting people to become interdependent and cooperative with one another. And they moved. They moved out of the Lower East Side to Woodmere. Very fancy, very fancy. And there was really, intentionally, and I think Annette says this, it was a way of the Jewish kids to become American without not being Jewish. It wasn't the idea of losing the Jewish identity, but to learn how to speak English without an accent. What was the Anglo-Saxon world like? All the teachers in the school were Irish or English. And it was done, I think, absolutely intentionally to prepare the kids for what was a very hostile society at that time, with the Jewish quotas and the discrimination and hostility to Jews was so intense. And Annette almost immediately showed evidence of genius. And to move ahead with this is that she was not accepted to Barnard because of the Jewish quota. She went to NYU and graduated with a published doctorate when she was 24. But due to the Great Depression, she had to work as a caseworker. And as a caseworker in the Great Depression, working in East New York, she became a communist. She made the bridge from socialism to communism. Communism are angry socialists, and she became angry. On her caseload, there were two fathers committed suicide in 1 year. And she said on the way home from East New York, she would go through the little park, and she would see the men sitting on the benches in their suits, and not to go home, like pretending they were working, or like pretending they were looking for a job, and how beaten and tragic it was. And that was her first encounter with communists. And what she saw is they were the people both willing and able to fight back. And how they fought back was to form a union. And she became engaged in that. And she didn't join the Communist Party immediately. That took a little bit of, but she entered that world. She entered that world. And her first work was with the unemployment councils. And I think this is so good for us to know, because what happened in that period is the Communist Party and others on the left would organize mass demonstrations in Union Square and marches, but part of that was the intention of recruiting the marchers and the participants to join the unemployed councils, not to just go home. We've had 400,000 women and even some men, on the demonstration, and they went home. That was now already 6 weeks ago. And that's quite different. And to sell the newspapers and to get people involved, that was intentional from the very beginning, that there was going to be some outcome to build a movement to resist and to move forward with social change. She became very involved, as the entire communist movement did, and others, with trying to save the Spanish Republic. And that was hugely important. And great work was done, particularly in New York, to raise money and to help the vets, the volunteers, to help them get to Europe. They had to go under false passports. When they got to France, they had to be taken secretly across the Pyrenees at night in order that they could join the army. It was very, very hard to get a vet into Spain, and to raise money for that, and money for ambulances and so on. And she's very involved with that. And it's very interesting. She joined the Communist Party during the Soviet-German pact, the non-aggression pact. Herbert Aptheker was the only other genius I ever knew, and I knew him quite well. He did the same. They both joined during a period when many people were leaving. And they both, I think, understood that without the Soviet Union, the Nazis could never be defeated. So if the Soviet Union was going to be defeated, there would be no hope. And they were smart. They were able to not just do, addition and subtraction, and not just algebra. They knew trigonometry. They figured it out. And she threw herself into the movement against intervention. And then what occurs is, I think, as she told me, is she was asked to run for office for the American Labor Party. And the American Labor Party was an enormous force in New York City and in New York State, and had enormous influence. At that time, there were two wings to the American Labor Party. There was a social democratic wing with Dubinsky and Alex Rose that were very anti-communist socialists. A lot of them came from the Menshevik wing in Russia. And then, of course, there was the left wing. The left wing was the communist Vito Marcantonio and Sidney Hillman from the Amalgamated Union and others were in the left wing. And it was a huge fight about who was going to win. And the party was sending the best people they had into running for office around this question, this political struggle. And Annette was asked to run for public office. How it worked was so splendid. They promoted people from that were connected. It was so interesting. They had such a good sense, that all the underrepresented groups were brought forward. Women running for public office. Italians, who had very few. Marcantonio was the only Italian congressman in the House of Representatives until 1944. LaGuardia before him was the only Italian in the House of Representatives, totally unrepresented politically on every level. And they brought forward many, many, many Italians, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans. And she was part of that. And it's there where she meets Marcantonio, because Marcantonio was the leader of the left wing, which then won in 1944, and then becomes the leader of the American Labor Party. So Marcantonio is a spokesman of the left in Congress, in the House of Representatives, a national spokesman, and then becomes the head of the American Labor Party in New York, which had the balance of political power in New York State, which had the largest population of any state in the United States, and was critical for the Democratic Party to win elections. So there's a lot of very real politics in this. Annette really, I think, loved Marcantonio and was devoted to him. It's so interesting with people on the left, where they would go from doing intellectual work to doing non-intellectual work, and seamlessly. You know, like Annette would give a lecture, but she'd also bring the meatloaf, you know, that type of thing. The person that would be presenting something would also put out the chairs. That she not only wrote for the journals, in every case she was on the board and helped promote the circulation. She would chair the annual meetings in her home. In other words, it wasn't just doing intellectual work, like it kind of, you know, the Mandarins, like, you know, Simone de Beauvoir, you know, about, you know, her memoirs about being on the American left and being involved with Mandarins, people that were communists but had no contact or no interest in doing anything involved with real people. But Marcantonio was from another world. He was from a world of having been born in a 3-room tenement, but almost for sure there would have been no central heating. Maybe there was a bathroom in the hall. And coming out of that life and being able to go to college is a very, very huge story in itself. But I think where Annette, what's so interesting is in that world, which was really, Marcantonio was not a member of the Communist Party, but he was in that world. And it was a very attractive world, I think, because people like Marcantonio and Annette could meet. There's very little of that in this society, where people of very different backgrounds, very different races, different classes, around a common cause, around the creation of a counterculture, and an alternative culture. I would prefer that term, actually. That people of very different backgrounds can conjoin and cooperate and build together and help one another understand life and reality more fully, and to develop a wonderful life, a full, good life. Always risking loss, always potential punishment, not that many victories, but the satisfaction of being with other people who've adopted a bigger life. And not necessarily, although in some cases it's happened, certainly not in the case of Annette, of not necessarily all ignoring, the basic lives that we all live. But, and they come together in the American Labor Party. But what Annette does immediately, and this was, everyone on the left in New York had to do something to help Marcantonio. That was just the law. So like there were 175 ALP clubs in New York City, can you imagine, in 1975. 175 clubs. In those clubs that helped people with their tax returns, it helped them with their disputes with landlords, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they were like community centers. There were social gatherings there and so on. And what Annette did who is now the leader of the Assembly District in the Upper West Side. What she now did was also became the organizer of the sound trucks for Yorkville, the southern part now of Marcantonio's congressional district after 1944. This is not an easy job to figure out where the stops are going to be, how this is going to be organized, who's going to be there, and taking up that kind of a job for him. They knew the last birthday party of Marcantonio. He died. He was born in December 9th, 2002, and the last birthday party he had before he died in August 12th was in Annette's house, and in this little apartment again. And one of the co-guest of honor before Marcantonio was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was there. And they sang Bandiera Rosa together. And this was at the worst time in the McCarthy era. And yet this kind of human activity occurred as well. Well, Annette was in a cab going to the funeral in East Harlem, the extraordinary funeral that we talked about of Marcantonio in 1954. And on the radio would be playing in the cabs in those days. The cab driver said, Vito Marcantonio is going to be buried today, and the funeral is attracting all the communists, or whatever. He goes, for the funeral of this member of the Communist Party. And Annette's mother, Jean, said, that's a lie. He wasn't a member of the Communist Party. And the cab driver turned around and said, what if he was? So, you know. And so I think that what then Annette did, you know, when some people are alive, you do them a favor, maybe they'll do a favor for you. Once they're dead, if you do something for them, that really shows something, you know? And so after Marcantonio died, by this point, she had now lost her work. She had been blacklisted, so she was no longer the principal of the school that her father had bought for her, in a sense, to get her a job suitable to her background. And the school, basically the funds of the school were seized by the state. They were returned in the 60s. The judge in the 60s couldn't believe it. He said, how did this happen? Well, in the McCarthy era, as some of us know, all kinds of things happened. And part was the seizing of the funds of the school. In any case, what occurred then, her mother taught at the school. So there was no income whatsoever that they had. Her brother helped her. Her brother owned a business. He lived on the same floor with her. And Annette in many ways raised his children, the twins. The mother wasn't that interested in that. And Annette and her mother raised twins, who then remained loyal to her for the rest of her life. I mean, you know, a good niece and nephew could be worth a lot, you know. So don't forget their birthdays. So what happened there is Annette then began writing. What the loss of employment caused her to do what maybe she could have or should have done all along, was to start writing. And she started writing these books, which Stefan is going to talk about, which gave her no fame in the United States, but which gave her an international reputation. But what Annette also then did, and I think the income, I'm so sorry I didn't think to ask her this, it must have, she had no money, and there was a memorial society, they must have given her some stipend, she had no funds. For 1 year, she went to the New York Public Library and wrote this book, which I really recommend, $10, a good deal. And these are all the excerpts of Marcantonio's debates and speeches, organized, and the legal cases for Du Bois and William Patterson and Ben Gold, which he'd won 2 of the 3, which is unheard of in that period, and dedicated her life to this. And there's so much more to say, except I think what Annette never let go of the memory of Marcantonio and his importance. And I think was very, very pleased that Roberto Rigoni and myself were able to get this reprinted, and this is a 2nd edition. And we had a huge celebration for that in the Museum of the City of New York, and sold lots of copies, and she was very, very happy. Well, after this affair with 300 people, I went home with her, and she had a dinner in the oven for 12 people. I once saw her, she had arthritis, and she had all of these tables set up for like 14 people, and her arm was in a sling. I said, Annette, how are you going? And you have a pork roast. You can't. She goes, I'm having it cut in 2. You know, I mean, she was just astoundingly dauntless person and incredibly productive with her writing, with her political work, with her personal life, with her family, with friends, with comrades. She really had got the whole thing right. And what she also got right was to understand that Vito Marcantonio was worth anybody and everybody's dedication and attention. Thank you.
I'm going to use that.
Next up, we have Stephen Siciliano, who told me he thinks of his presentation as Annette, Rubinstein, and Romantic Rebels. Stephen is a journalist with 30 years experience. He's the author of 2 novels, Vedette, or Conversations with the Flamenco Shadows, and The Sidewalk Smoker Club. He edits the website Marcantoniana, items from the life and times of the marvelous Vito Marcantonio. He is currently shopping a manuscript novel based on the radical congressman's life called The Good Father. So direct from California, let's welcome Steve Siciliano.
Thank you, Gil, and thank you, Jerry, for having me here. I became familiar with the Vito Marcantonio Forum in my capacity as a novelist. I came across an article of Jerry's on East Harlem and contacted him, and here I am some 5 years later sharing the lectern or the table or the dais with him, and it's a real honor to do so, and it's an honor to speak in front of all of you. I only come from time to time to do these talks, but the work of the forum is something that really impresses me, and I hope you keep at it. I've spoken with Jerry once or twice about my concern with Marcantonio, which is, although my politics align with his perfectly, I'm a novelist, and I chose to get involved with his life story for anecdotal reasons. He's a marvelous character. He makes for great literature. He's a story after a story after a story. And I've spoken with Jerry once or twice about Mark's engagement with the demi-monde in New York, the bohemians of his time, and what his literary diet was like. And Jerry is of the opinion that, for the most part, you're going to find Vito Marcantonio at a social club, at his own political club, or in a private residence somewhere in East Harlem, playing cards and having wine. And in spite of the 8 years of research I've done on Marcantonio to do the novel, I never questioned Jerry. He just knows much more, and I'm never going to catch up to him. But this was Damon Runyon's New York, this metropolis, cultural cauldron sitting atop the pyramid of world cities. That's Marcantonio's New York, and he has friendships with Dorothy Parker, Howard Fast, the author of Spartacus. The painter Rockwell Kent is a comrade of his. The Puerto Rican poet Clemente Velez Soto is another acquaintance. Dashiell Hammett, the poet of Collision, served on the finance committee of Marcantonio's 1949 mayoral run. Marcantonio joined many luminaries in the literary world in an effort to forestall the termination of the Federal Writers Project, the Works Project Administration, the WPA. The federal government paid writers to generate literature. He spoke out when it was not convenient to do so on behalf of the Hollywood 10 writers. And on his staff was this literary lioness, this Annette T. Rubinstein, author of The Great Tradition in English Literature from Shakespeare to Shaw. And by great tradition, she means the great realists who know and are concerned with the vital current steadily flowing beneath the innumerable eddies and confusing cross currents of life's surface. She was influenced by Georg Lukács. He was a Hungarian communist who served as an education minister in ill-fated Soviet government just after the revolution in Russia, and then much later in I believe the 50s or 60s, when he had fallen out with Stalin and he was part of the reform movement in that country. But anyway, he was a specialist in literary criticism. In 1937, he wrote a book called The Historical Novel, and in that book, Lukács noted that with the rollback of the French Revolution, the defenders of human progress needed to come up with an ideology that placed that revolution in a situation of necessity in the development of history, as opposed to what the restorers of monarchy were calling it at the time, which was kind of a natural bloody disaster. So out of that construct arose a new humanism, and it wanted to preserve the achievements of the French Revolution as the imperishable basis for all future human development. So the French Revolution created a schism in the way we are going to tell the story of the past going forward, and that schism exists with us today. Lukács said that this new humanism recognized the decisive role played by the struggle between classes in the development of history. And so he says what matters in a historical novel, what matters in literature, is not the retelling of great historical events, but the poetic awakening of the people who figured in those events. Lukács gives literature a job to achieve a new immediacy, he says, to re-individualize the general in man and his destiny. That is the mission of artistic form. Now he's being prescriptive. The historical novel represents Lukács' attempt to humanize what he considered to be the crude determinism of Marxist thought, to give working class consciousness and action roles in the development of history, as opposed to capitalism has created these circumstances and no matter what we do, it's just going to happen. He says a writer's relation to history is not something special and isolated. It is an important component of his relations to the whole of reality, and especially society. And as a consequence, the novel, he says, must be historically authentic, root and branch. Now, Annette would later publish a similar review to the English tradition on American literature, and she would call that root and flower. A feminization of Lukács' literary concept? I do not know, because I haven't read it yet. I'm going to call her Annette, not out of disrespect. I did not know her the way Jerry did, but in the spirit of what I consider this to be more of a revival and a remembrance of someone that has been forgotten, as opposed to a dry academic exercise. So in the historical novel, Lukács formulates a new Marxist aesthetic, and it's related to a specific genre. But Annette extends his analytical tool to poetry, drama, the novel, essays, and anything else English literature can cook up. And she is writing this in a didactic fashion. If you're the reader of the great tradition, you become aware very quickly that you are being spoken to, you are being taught. And so she begins her lecture with this restatement of the idea that the writer's political engagement matters in weighing the value of their work. True, it has long been a dogma in the academy, as she says, that art and politics are different worlds, that the value of the work of art is unaffected by the artist's relation to social movements of his own time, his concern with human needs, and his hopes for future progress. And in the last 3/4 of a century, she writes in 1957, the artist himself has been all too often concurred in this belief. But his acceptance of his separation from society, whether melancholy or defiant, she says, has always been a special instance of that alienation from man that is so characteristic of the late part of the great bourgeois epoch. Now, I'm not a Marxist scholar, but that sounds something like the reading of Karl Marx into the history of English literature. She quotes the old miner's song, "They say in Harlan County, there are not neutrals here," and so it is in the great world of art. The great world of art. Her choice of words on this first leaf of a 900-plus page opus tips us off to the relish and enthusiasm with which she attacks her subject. The great tradition represents Annette's attempt at a rapid survey. A rapid survey of literature in the expanding bourgeois world during its hopeful youth and its troubled but still rich maturity. So we're talking about Shakespeare from about 1580 to George Bernard Shaw in 1935 when he dies. And she says, a full consideration of the life and work of the figures in the history of English literature shows us just how clear concise, and complete, the great writer's consistently progressive partisanship in the social and political strife of his own time has always been. I would like to comment for a second on the depth and breadth of this effort. There are 20-some odd authors, many of them literary lights, and others who have passed from our recognition. She's read all of them, and by all of them I mean she's read their letters, their juvenilia, all of their books. She's read people's letters to them. She's read people's letters to one another about them. She's read books about them by people who knew them and books about them by people who did not know them. An incredible absorption of information followed by the writing that is at once analytical, historical, literary, and laced with a whimsy that makes it really a delight to read. When Gerald Meyer sends this to you in the mail and says, we're going to have a talk in a few months, good luck. It can be intimidating, but do not be put off by the appearance of this book. It's just a treat to read. And so her application of Lukács' analytical tool finds much to admire, for example, in the work of Bernard Shaw. He was a Fabian socialist and a writer of intense engagement with the politics of his time. But she notes that in his novel, The Unsocial Socialist, Shaw's picture of the exploitation upon which his society was built is crystal clear. But as always, she says, there is no hint of any potential power in the exploited to overthrow their masters and save themselves. So she said that for all of his progressive activity, in a literary sense, he's a bit of a snob because he cannot envision the working class taking care of its own business and taking a lead in history. She writes enthusiastically about women in English literature, is admiring of George Eliot, who's really Mary Evans Cross, until the time of her marriage, which Annette says set her apart from the activities and movements in which she would otherwise have increasingly participated. She means that she had been domesticated. It was a successful marriage for this woman, but it ended up setting her apart, leaving her out of touch, again, with that vital current flowing steadily beneath the innumerable eddies and confusing cross currents of life's surface. So the group that best meets Lukács' criteria for blending progressive activism and political literature were the Romantics, and I would suggest it's because they themselves set the benchmarks. In his literary classic, Literary Theory, Terry Eagleton remarks that it's only with the Romantic era that our definitions of literature begin to take shape. The word poetry no longer refers in the Romantic era to a simple technical mode of writing. It has deep political, social, and philosophical meanings, and at the sound of it, he says, the ruling class might very well reach for its gun. Literature has become an alternative ideology, and the imagination itself, a political force. By the time of Shelley's defense of poetry in 1821, it signifies a conception of human creativity that is radically at odds with the utilitarian ideology of early capitalist England. Now, In Defense of Poetry, written by Percy Shelley, was in response to an essay by someone suggesting that poets ought to stay in their elegant little boxes where they belong. Shelley was angry. The most unfailing herald companion and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion and institution. Well, that's poetry. And it's impossible, he said, to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled by the electric life which hums with their words. A wonderful modern writing, and at this point, the streets of London are lit with gas and electricity as this mystical force beyond the grasp of people. And yet here he is including it in his writing. And Annette quotes Sir Walter Scott. He says of the Romantics, "Remember the hour. It was the eve of the 80s when the art joined the isms, went over with a rush to their traditional enemy. They joined the majority. They made friends with the mob. Sculptors, painters, poets, for the first time in English history, deserted the aristocrats and lined up with the proletarian." And what do these great Romantics want? Democratic revolution is what they want. Annette quotes the Whig Party reformer Dr. Price. And now methinks I see the ardor for liberty spreading and catching. A general amendment beginning in human affairs. The change of dominion of kings for the dominion of law. A change for the dominion of priests giving way to the dominion of reason and conscience. So there are two romanticisms as typically accepted, all right? There's a first group that came of age during the French Revolution, and their writings were political, progressive, and precarious for them to script. It was founded by a group called the Lake Poets, and it included William Hazlitt, Samuel Coleridge, Charles Lamb, this gentleman named Leigh Hunt, who was an essayist, but really spent a lot of time in jail and getting into trouble because he was the publisher of these people. And of course, William Wordsworth, who wrote the signature verse identifying these people with the French Revolution. And remember what Lukács is telling us about the French Revolution in relation to the development of literature moving forward. Writes Wordsworth, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country romance." As if to say public affairs is fun, almost like a carnival. The poets of his time, Wordsworth said, were not called to exercise their skills in utopia, subterranean fields, some secreted island, heaven knows where, but in the very world that is the world of all of us, the place where in the end we make our happiness or not at all. Wordsworth and Coleridge's preface to their lyrical ballads, an important work they wrote together, Annette says, demonstrates Wordsworth's democratic beliefs and revolutionary character in a literary world still accepting of 18th century notions of elegance for poetry. They wrote, as a sample of what she's talking about, humble and rustic life was generally chosen, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. And this is the re-individualizing of life Lukács called for, a stepping away from what he considered a hollow narrative based around the movements of masses or great leaders for a more granular consideration of the time being depicted. But Terry Eagleton reminds us that with Romanticism's assertion of all power to the imagination, we begin to detect a more familiar emphasis, a stress upon the imagination's splendid remoteness from the merely prosaic matters of feeding one's children or fighting for social justice. He says the assumption that there was an unchanging object known as art, or an isolatable experience called beauty, was largely a product of their very alienation of art from social life. And that's because things are not going well for the Romantics. It is a very repressive England in which a group of working men will gather in a park to protest not work or wages, but hunger, and the government will just as soon shoot them. They are being marginalized. After that rush to join the mob, the proletarian, the movement in art, does a slow U-turn in the opposite direction. So there's a second wave of Romantics led by George Gordon, Lord Byron, the aforementioned Shelley, and John Keats, and they are pegged with having developed the more familiar conception of Romanticism as something private, personal, and apart from the life of the world. Annette Rubinstein sees it differently. The early guard, she writes, the older Romantics were mostly Jacobins first, and later reactionaries. The younger died young in the faith for which they had lived. Hazlitt, one of the late poets, defines a Jacobin as someone who makes neither peace nor truce with tyrants. His hatred of wrong ceases only with the wrong, his sense of it, and the bare-faced assumption of the right to inflict it deprives him of rest. That's a Jacobin. But Romanticism's turn away from the world then was the doing of the early guard, according to Annette. And Hazlitt later said of these gentlemen, they could not live without the smiles of the great. Instead of going into a profitable business, changing their lyres for ledgers, their pens for plows, they chose to a rather mock defense of the most barefaced of all mummeries, the pretended alliance of kings and people. So the once thin and intense revolutionary filled out in middle age to a comfortable burgher is an archetype in Western art. These men, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they became poets laureate, accepted comfortable sinecures in government, and essentially cashed out. Annette asserts that the turn in their activism showed in the Jacobins' work, and she pulls no punches. There's no profit in pursuing further the rest of Wordsworth's life, which has really been called the most dismal anticlimax of which the history of literature holds record. And she quotes Shelly on Wordsworth's backsliding. "In honored poverty thy voice did weave, songs consecrate to truth and liberty. Deserting these thou leavest me to be, thus having been, that thou shouldst cease to be." And this is how they insulted one another. This is the tweet of the 17th century and 18th century. You got into a review or a newspaper and you insulted this gentleman in the most elegant way you could. And when I compare today's comment threads with the poetry, in the end, the subtlety and the command of language that these gentlemen use is infinitely more effective than the vulgarity that you run into when you're debating the presidential election for the 50th time. All right, so by those who died young, for which they lived, she means Byron and Shelley, whose lives as well as literary output she examines in a chapter entitled Against the Unholy Alliance, an overtly political logo chosen by Annette. Applying Lucat's method, Annette reorders these groupings. She rescues the younger romantics from the responsibility of having rebranded romanticism as something decadent and reactionary. She begins her analysis with some doggerel from Dorothy Parker. Shelley's fair brow was all custard with curls, and Byron walked out with a number of girls. Keats was never descended from earls, which doesn't detract from the lyrical feats of Byron and Shelley, and Byron and Shelley, and Byron and Shelley and Keats. For Annette, this aptly summarizes 9/10 of the biographical studies devoted to these gentlemen, and it's obviously she thinks it's incorrect, off point. And she says it may seem difficult to reconcile the avowedly political and revolutionary orientation of the work of all the great earlier romantics with the later use of the word, which has so far overshadowed the original meaning that unsophisticated readers might be forgiven for thinking that Coleridge found his romanticism in his opium dreams, Wordsworth's in his retirement to the Lake Country, Byron with his mistresses and travels, and Shelley with his elopement to marry Wollstonecraft Godwin. He says, but Wordsworth and Coleridge ended rather than began their great period of romantic writing when they retired from the world. Byron never ceased his direct attacks upon injustices, and Shelley, throughout all of it, wrote many more lines about exploitation than he ever did about love. Making a point here. These are not the frilly personal guys. These were the ones who are at the forefront and probably went farther than the late poets did because of the time in which they did it. She says they came of age as the early Jacobins softened. But theirs is not the romanticism that strives to live in the private world of personal emotions, solitary daydreams, and cultivated tastes. In fact, she says, if you look at the lives and the objective circumstances, it was impossible for young men coming of age in a world to feel the rapturous, idyllic mood of that dawn when it had been bliss to be alive, and to be young was very heaven. Contrary to all the laws of romance, she says, evil seemed to have grown stronger, finally appeared completely invulnerable. The laws of romance I take to mean that good will win, justice will prevail. And at this point in time, that's not what they are experiencing. So I'm going to do a little biography. When you read the great tradition, you are in a wonderful world of alternation. Sometimes she's giving you history, sometimes she's giving you poetry, sometimes she's giving you biography, and it comes in the most natural flowing fashion. It just pops up when it does, and I hope that these two biographies, brief, of Byron and Shelley are as quick and clear as hers. Shelley is born a couple of years after the French Revolution. He's the heir to a baronetcy and a landed estate of great wealth. He studied at Oxford. He wrote on the necessity of atheism and got thrown out of Oxford, and his father broke with him and cut off his money. He followed this up with a marriage to a friend of one of his sister, Harriet Westbrook, also disapproved of. He made a stand for Irish freedom, published a pamphlet, distributed himself, went off to Ireland, gave a speech, and had a lot of resonance. And we're talking about a fellow who's 20 years old. His father was somewhat impressed, and he agreed to a reconciliation if Shelley would only inform Oxford of his return to Christianity. Wouldn't do it. Things cooled with Harriet, and he moved on to the daughter of political philosopher William Godwin and early feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft. And Godwin, in his writings, preached free love. But he took one look at Shelley and tried to run him off. He had the wrong man, and his daughter would end up eloping and becoming Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. All right. Harriet, from whom he was estranged, had a child by him. A little bit later, Mary had a child by him, but it was premature and died. Harriet drowned herself. Shelley and Mary dodged creditors. In 1815, he wrote The Revolt of Islam, which is an idealization of the French Revolution. Again, remember what Lukács is telling us about the influence of this event upon literature at these times. He wrote the epic poem, Prometheus Unbound, and others under the pall of a resulting depression from another of his children dying. In July of 1822, still in Italy, he takes off in a boat to go scheme politically with Byron. A storm comes up, he disappears, he washes up on shore. A couple of weeks later, a volume of Keats's poetry still in his overcoat. You know, you can make this stuff up, but with the Romantics, it's already there for you. And so you see with Shelley this mixture of tremendous strife, activism, and feverish writing of a remarkable quality. All right, so Byron, he lived alone with his mother, who had been abandoned by his father. He had a clubfoot, which didn't make his unhappy circumstances any happier. His mother was an ardent sympathizer of the French Revolution, and it rubbed off on him. When he was 10, a distant relative died, and suddenly he became Lord Byron and the inheritor of a debt-laden estate. He became a peer at the age of 21, took his seat in the House of Lords, and gave radical speeches in defense of Luddite weavers and imprisoned debtors. He held up a mirror so that England might see itself, said and wrote things like the following: I have traversed the seat of war in the peninsula. I have been in some of the most oppressed provinces in Turkey, but never under the despotic rule of infidel governments did I behold such squalid wretchedness as I have seen since my return in the very heart of this Christian nation. And these kind of writings were notorious in London. It made him a fashionable figure and also a hunted one who eventually had to leave England. So he goes off to Italy, he gets involved in a failed revolution. Not to be deterred, he moves over to Greece and joins the fight for independence there. And during the campaign, a military campaign, he gets a fever and he dies. Annette quotes Karl Marx. The real difference between Byron and Shelley is this: those who understand and love them rejoice that Byron died at 36, because if he had lived, he would have become a reactionary bourgeois. They grieve that Shelley died at 29 because he was essentially a revolutionist and would always be in the front guard of socialism. So Marx was familiar with Byron and Shelley and considered them allies in the struggle. Maybe Marx read this stanza in Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy. Rise, like lions from slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to the earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen upon you. Ye are many, they are few. Said Marx, or wrote Marx, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Maybe Marx cribbed the line. These men may have striven to be legends in their time, but it's fair to suggest they may have just been feeling their way along just the way the rest of us do. In his curious narrative of the French Revolution, Thomas Carlyle wrote that no man or nation of men conscious of doing a great thing was ever in that thing doing other than a small one. And I think this is what Lukács and Annette are looking for: a view to history behind the slogans and final outcomes, a focus on the particular motivations that gave rise to social change, that vital current flowing steadily beneath life's surface. Which, of course, doesn't detract from the lyrical feats of Byron and Shelley, and Byron and Shelley, and Byron and Shelley and Keats. So what happened to Keats? Annette pulls Keats out of Dorothy Parker's doggerel, and out of that triumvirate with Byron and Shelley, and pairs him with Charles Lamb, 20 years his senior, in a new category. This is her addition to literary analysis, the last of the great romantics. In Keats and Lamb, she says, we find two great writers who are radical in their sympathies and friendships and sometimes actions, but for the most part did their most important work in non-political terms. The fruits of Keats and Lamb's labor show the beginning of this romanticism that took on a different meaning later on. But in Keats's poetry, she says, helps us to endure and enjoy the world rather than change it. But he never belonged to the school of art for art's sake that so strenuously tried to claim him, she says, nor was he a romantic in the decadent sense of the word. She finds in this particular verse of Keats a pledge to assume the somber struggles of maturity. First, the riem I'll pass of Flora and old Pan. I'll sleep in the grass, feed upon apples red and strawberries, and choose each pleasure that my fancy sees, catch the white-handed nymph in shady places, to woo sweet kisses from averted faces. And can I ever bid these joys farewell? Yes, I must pass them for a nobler life, where I may find the agonies, the strife of human hearts. Alas, poor Keats found some agonies and strife in his own heart, and the heart of those that he loved. Let me see. Give me a second. The nobler life upon which Annette speculated was never realized because he was cut down very young. He had a terrible turn through this world. And he said that the great English poets are great because in general they have been trampled aside in the bypaths of society. When he was 9, his father fell from a horse and died. His mother married another man, but when she left him, lost all her property because English marriage law did not recognize the right of women to have property. Unlike Byron and Shelley, he had no patrons, no stipends, however reduced for being naughty. He studied to be an apothecary, a post of modest class standing in that England, in which he had no interest. Shaw said, his Isabella or the Pot of Basil read something that Marx would have written were he given to poetry instead of treatises on capitalism. And Annette says, his liberal point of view can be found in his letters, and there's no long poem of Keats that does not contain some social commentary. She notes that there were in many of the diatribes against Shelley the peculiar attitude we have seen manifested toward Lord Byron of, quote, come back to your class and all will be forgiven. You belong with us and not with the Cockney vulgarians and foreign radicals. Well, poor Keats. For these same critics, he was the Cockney vulgarian. In its takedown of his book Endymion, the Quarterly Review, a very influential publication of the time, called him a friend of radicals and a starveling apothecary apprentice who had the impudence to want to mix with gentlemen and write poetry like his betters. Imagine how cruel to see that written about you and something influential. This, and like reviews, of course, finished Keats off his prospects of living by writing. As he did with his mother first, he nursed his brother Thomas to death and feverishly wrote, and in declining health himself died at the age of 26. Wrote Lord Byron, who killed John Keats? I, said the Quarterly, savagely and tardily. 'Twas one of my feats. So we'll close now with Charles Lamb, the second of these two. Annette notes he admitted no interest in politics, but chose his friends and associates from among the increasingly unpopular radical minority. And this is important in England, of a very reduced society in which 10,000 people out of 10 million have the franchise to vote. When you make a stand, it's going to have some resonance. So Charles Lamb, who avoids politics in his writing, does not avoid scandalous people and his social life. And so she says it's necessary to feel Lamb's peculiar obligations if we are to fully understand how he could consistently submit to the conditions of a life of quiet desperation. Thoreau, right? and yet maintained unblunted the sensibility and integrity that typified his work. And it was a life of quiet desperation. This gentleman, his depressive sister, killed his mother in front of him. She was mad, and then she was not mad, and she was in and out of institutions for years, burdening him, not for years, for decades. He had a youthful fling with London radicals, but wound up working in the belly of the beast. His real works, say Annette, are bound into the 20 large ledgers at the East India House. He was a clerk until he retired. And they were meaningless works, she points out. The whole alienation of man from himself is expressed in what Lamb describes as the waste of 2/3 of his life. He wrote Wordsworth, "You don't know how wearisome it is to breathe the air of four-pent walls without relief, day after day, all the golden hours between 10 and 4. You should try working in today's economy." Annette quotes Wordsworth to illuminate Lamb's plight. "The world is too much for us, late and soon, getting and spending. We lay waste to our powers. We have given our lives away, a sordid boon." And so she says of him, "The loving particularity with which he dwells on the small physical and greater intellectual indulgences, all the cheap and fine indulgences which life for the city dweller within the means of a narrow purse has made him as helpful and personal a friend to whole generations of readers as he was to scores of hard-pressed contemporaries." I think that she is saying here there is something revolutionary in his ability to get nutrition from what is free and at hand in life. He's not selling out a cause in the way Wordsworth did. He's coping with the material conditions mostly imposed upon him, maintaining his spirit. Does it matter? It does. Annette recasts Byron and Shelley as infinitely more serious men of their times, and she does Cates and Lamb an even greater service. Their work is, in and of itself, not focused on social matters, but she assesses them as more akin to the earlier revolutionary romantics who wore their rebellion both on their sleeves and in their writings. Even if with Cates and Lamb, it's more on their sleeve than in the writing. She separates them from the later decadent romantics. She creates a hybrid bridge, if you will, linking the earlier Jacobins to the private poets, with two writers possessing the characteristics of each category, the two last great romantics. Now, Cates is Cates. But Charles Lamb is less known, and had Annette not been erased from the story of this city and this country, we might know him better than we do as well. But we don't. And in the spirit of remembering with which we are engaged here today, I'm going to close with part of a letter Lamb wrote to a gloomy Quaker friend of his. He says, "Honey and honeycomb, roses and violets are still in the earth. The sun and moon yet reign in the heaven. The lesser lights keep up their pretty twinkling. Meats and drinks, sweet sights and sweet smells, a country walk, spring and autumn, follies and repentance, quarrels and reconcilements have all the sweetness by turns. Good humor and good nature, friends at home that love you, and friends abroad that miss you. You possess all these, and more innumerable. And these are all sweet things. You may extract honey from everything. Do not go a gathering after gall." Thank you.
We have a very few minutes left, but I'd like to call on Alfred, who took courses with Annette, and maybe you could comment a little.
Well, I have some material that people could look at the end, so I just want to bring that. Sure. It's more than 10 minutes. I had the pleasure of taking 2 classes with Annette in her apartment on West 71st Street. And one of the classes, where should I? You can come right here. Yeah, well, none of this is prepared. None of this is prepared because I was advised last night that I would make a few remarks. It turns out that one of the classes that I took at Annette's apartment, and I'll never forget it, was called The English Romantics and the French Revolution, and we read the first section of volume 2 of the literary history. I have both volumes of that, The Great Tradition from Shakespeare to Shaw. I haven't looked at volume 1 yet. I hope I do before I go to the other dimension, but I have read big chunks of volume 2, and I also have her American literary history, Root and Flower, which I have, most of which I've read ever since I acquired them. But the one of the things that Annette emphasized in that class was that although she could appreciate the schools of literary creation that stand for art's sake, that was not obviously what she felt to be the greatest contributions of novelists or writers, but rather, as our speaker so elegantly expressed it, only art, or primarily art, novels, poetry, which has political engagement, sociological commentary, historical analysis. That is what she emphasized. For example, she wrote for the Monthly Review Press as a literary critic, and I just came across this last night when I was informed that I would make her. She wrote an article called In Defense of History, Marxism and the Postmodern Agenda. And it's a rather long article. I think I read it, but that's a long time ago. I also took another course with her on poets, and she compiled, I have it here, she compiled from various poets, starting with, and writers. This is what she prepared for us. 2002, Political Poetry Scrapbook. She has on various pages Hardy, Sandburg, Robert Burns, many poems from Pablo Neruda, Brecht. Anyway, right down to toward the end, she has Shakespeare on one page, Shelley, and all of these poems. I will never, throw this out as I begin to disburden papers which have accumulated over the years, because all of these poems she researched for the content of the how should I put it, proletarian concerns of the working class masses, and in any case, after the elegant discourses, there's not much more I can say other than it was such an honor to know her. I took at least 2 classes in her apartment on West 71st, and at the end of one of them, she was 90 years old, so the participants and some other people, we took Annette 1 block down West 71st towards, I think, Amsterdam Avenue, where there was an Italian restaurant. The name I had Giardino, and I think it was Bello Giardino, and we had a celebration dinner, and I have here, I managed to find this last night, I have a picture of the celebration. She was 90, with various friends and students of hers. Somebody brought a bouquet of red roses, and I think there was a bottle of champagne. There certainly was a lot of wine, and we had a dinner, and we feted her, and you can look at this if it interests you. There's not too much more I can say other than that it was a great honor to have known her and to have been inspired by her message.
So, I want to mention before we end this program today, well, we have to be very careful about our time. Okay. David, would you like to please make it? Please be very, okay.
I can't do it.
No, you have to.
I'll try, I know. Well, it's going to be brief,
Okay, good.
because Gil just asked me, I'm sorry, Jerry just asked me when I came in today if I would say some words, so I have no time to prepare.
Go closer to the mic.
Yeah, I was just informed as I came in that Jerry had asked me if I could say some words, and I'm very happy to. But Annette, I took many cool classes with her. There was a group of us who formed a little community, and we would take classes one after the other, and there was no end. You know, we explored Shakespeare, and we explored the Romantic poets, and we explored American literature, and modern theater, and Brecht, and Lukács, and we would go through a cycle or a year or something, and Annette would see some other aspect of Shakespeare or some other theme or perspective that we hadn't touched on, and she would, you know, formulate a whole new, you know, kind of classes, and we would go over some of the same plays, but from a totally different aspect. It was just wonderful. I mean, I'm thinking now about the food was always there. It was always supplied by Annette or some of her students, and we were in this little L-shaped room. There was a picture of Paul Robeson on over the sofa, so you know we all knew that was the seat that Paul Robeson would sit on. And Annette, of course, you know, she really provided the context. I mean, for her, the social context, the political, the economic context of the literature was everything, really, as well as the literature. They were not separate at all, and she took great delight in pointing out how the bourgeois critics would separate these things out, and just to the point of messing up on all sides of the literature. I remember she said she really enjoyed, Paul Robeson said until he read her book on Othello, he never realized, or that was the first time, she was the first person to really get what he was trying to do, Paul Robeson was trying to do with this character of Othello on the stage. And he said no one else had the feel that Annette did. So basically it was so many things. I mean, you know, it's coming back to me, but you know, the sense of community, as I say, was very strong, and it was just a treasure to listen to Annette. She was always incredibly prepared. I mean, you would come in, she had done all of the work, the classes would start right on time, and she had all the preparation down, all the handouts down, everything that we were going to do. And we would also get a lot of personal accounts from her time teaching in China, from her time teaching in East Germany. I think she met Lukács, I'm not sure.
Yes, twice.
Yeah, and I think possibly Brecht too, if I'm not mistaken. She enjoyed that. She loved teaching in China. It made a great impression on all of her students. Some of her young female students could not understand how come she could not be married. It was just totally incomprehensible to them. But at any rate, and when she got over there, she discovered that the Chinese had taken her book's 3-volume set on English literature, and without giving her royalties, it basically copied the whole thing. And she was very happy that they did it. The royalties meant nothing to her. And they then asked her, could you do the same thing for English literature? And she said she would be very happy to, and that's where her English literature book came out. She was wonderful and dedicated right to the end. I mean, you could see her health was failing, but she stayed with the class as long as she could, and we really missed her and still miss her quite a bit. So anyway, thank you for putting this on.
Very briefly. Should I come up? Yeah, I'm going to mention. From here or you want to mention the writing circle and mention Adam's curation of those?
Wow, well, what a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. So good to be here, and this is what Annette did. She brought people together to learn about something that we've forgotten, is that we on the left, socialists, communists, Marxists, we're the inheritors of all the decency that developed from the French Revolution and went forward. And all the garbage belongs to them, but all the good stuff belongs to us. And we are many, they are few. And the inspiration for this, if you know, there are some people here that don't believe in God, and there's some who do. We're not going to get into that for sure. But I'll tell you, for those who don't believe in God, you better have something like literature and art, you know, or you're going to be in trouble. I last saw Annette 3 weeks before she died. She had her niece is a medical doctor, and her niece was coming to check her out her situation. She had congestive heart failure, and her heart was gone. It was just gone. And so she liked me to be there when her family was there. She's had some sense, which is true. If you're going to have a family dinner, absolutely invite some friends, because family are just awful. You know what I mean? I mean, you know, there's obligation and all of that, and there's all this resentments and all this crap. So invite friends, and they act better. Families will really act like they'll really act normal. You know, the best they can do. She had all this good sense. I mean, it was just amazing. And enough sense not to marry a jerk, you know. She would have lost everything. She would have lost 90% of her life. And so in any case, so she invited me there. And the niece brought along 2 kids that were utterly uproarious. You know, they were being raised like, you know, progressively, whatever. So I sort of was able to help a little bit with that. And then the examination didn't go too well, apparently, you know, that before, about her heart. And when she left, she was sort of, you know, I was helping her, and she couldn't get out of her chair. And I said, can I help you? She says, because she knew that unless I took her home or stayed there, she had to get out of the chair. It was excruciatingly painful to watch this, I can't tell you. And her efforts. And you did not disobey Annette about anything, I want you to know. And finally she got out of the chair and was able to walk a little bit to another chair and sit down. And the day before had been the last session of her last class. And she said to me, I guess I have to make a call to cancel the meeting for Science and Society. She was hosting the Writers Collective for Science and Society, which she did. And then I don't know. What she then did, it was very painful. And what she did is she stopped eating. She stopped eating and went to bed for 3 weeks and saw people. Claire, you were there. There's so many people that went to visit her. She had a stream of visitors. While she was dying, she remembered poetry, and she recited poetry to herself. And her last words were, I'm comfortable.
Thank you.